If you've been listening to this show for a while, then you'll know that I'm Scottish, and you'll know that because I bring it up pretty much any chance I can get. So what's the most ridiculous way that I could bring my home country into this show about literature from China? Well, it's probably what you're going to hear in this episode. This is a truly strange one. We're going to be talking about a poem called Prince Tuan, which takes, well, I won't tell you what it does because you'll find out in the interview. I'll be speaking with Lee Moore of the Chinese Literature Podcast. You can look forward to that. You can look forward to me talking like I know an awful lot about the Jacobite rebellions. But before all of that, we're going to do the Fic news, the translated Chinese fiction news. Now, I've got a little bit of a sore throat this fine afternoon, so I've got 5 news items, but I will try to get through them relatively quickly, just so that my throat doesn't choke up, so I don't cough all over this lovely microphone and by proxy into your ear. That would be pretty gross. So our first news item is a new book called Bad Kids by Chen Zijin, or Zijin Chen. He is translated in this text by none other than Michelle Dieter. I received a copy of this book from Michelle just yesterday, actually, so I should be reading it probably fairly soon, but we shall see. We did cover Chen Zijin on this show before. We did his The Untouched Crime, so if you're curious, check that episode out. Okay, news item number 2. It's another book that has just come out. I think we've heard about this one on the show from very early on. Its publication got delayed a little while, but it's now here. It's Shanxi Opera, aka Qinqiang in the original Chinese, by Jiaping Hua, and the translators are more friends of the pod, Nikki Harman and Dylan Levi King. So this one's finally out. It's published by Amazon Crossing, so the link I put in the show notes just goes to Amazon page. And yeah, just go get it. Just go read the thing. It's got an interesting cover. Okay, another news item involving Nikki Harman, our third news item. This is just a link to an article she has written called Found in Translation, where she takes a look at the state of translated Chinese literature today and like how not certain books get the promotion that they need, or they may not get the promotion that they need. I confess I've not read it top to bottom. I've just skimmed it, but it is there for you to read. Similarly, another article I have not read all the way through, our fourth news item. It's from the China Project, which is the new name of SupChina, a very good like media news outlet thingy. Don't really know if you call it anything besides a website, but anyway, SupChina is now called the China Project, and they've got an article called Why Do China Books All Look the Same? So it's if you're thinking mostly of like these non-fiction ones about usually something political, they're red, probably got big yellow letters for the title. There's maybe a picture of Xi Jinping or a dragon. Those books, there's sort of it's a breakdown with some quotes and interviews with experts as to why so many books end up that way. So that should be an interesting one for you. Again, not read the thing. I will not pretend that I've read the thing, but the link is in the show notes. Okay, and the last news item. This one is interesting. It's a new edition of Wild Grass, Ye Cao, the Lu Xun book, paired alongside with Morning Blossoms Gathered at Dusk, also by Lu Xun. So this is a new translation, translated by none other than Aileen J. Chung, and this marks the third time that Wild Grass has been translated. There's an original, there was a first translation by, I believe, Gladys and Xianyi Yang, or Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang, however you want to name that couple, for, I think, the Foreign Languages Press in Beijing quite a long time ago. On this show, we looked at a slightly alternative style translation called Weeds by Matt Turner. Yep, that's right. And this new translation is also titled Wildgrass. So you can now get 3 different versions in English alongside the Chinese. This one is published by Harvard University Press. So yeah, I could just read the blurb for this thing, but I'll save you that. The link is in the show notes. That's all my news items. I think my throat will thank me for being concise. So now, on with the interview. Let's hear from Lee Moore and what he had to say about Prince Tuan. Go. All right.
差不多
Exactly. Right. So on the show, I have Li Moore of the Chinese Literature podcast. And of course, he's here to duel with me to the death to become the premier, to claim the spot of the premier English language Chinese lit podcast. Not really. Although dueling and battle is kind of a theme of the text we're looking at this time. We'll get to that in a minute. Long-time listeners of the show who've never listened to Lee's podcast before, will still have heard his voice, because he's been on this one before. He came on with his co-host Rob on the mega crossover episode, somewhere around episode 50. But now he's here solo. So, yeah, for listeners who don't know, he's, like I said, he's the host, one of the two hosts of the Chinese Literature podcast, which you should all check out, especially if you think my episodes are too long, because they do nice bite-sized ones. And also, if you think my stuff is too modern, the Chinese Literature podcast skews a bit more dynastic as well. So that's another thing it's got going for it. Anyway, I'll stop doing your marketing. Lee, how's it going? What have you been up to since you were last on the Translated Chinese Lit podcast?
Well, it's going good. I finished my PhD. I defended my dissertation in November, and I think I graduated technically in December of 2021. And I made a baby since then. So we're about 2 weeks out from my number 2 coming into the world while we're recording this. I'm not sure where that will be in terms of when it airs. But so some momentous changes in my life. I'm also I'm working on a book that is essentially going to try and use the podcast as a platform that explains some of the big news stories in China that are happening right now, but it kind of gives the backstory using literature, history, culture, that sort of thing. So, for example, I'm working on a section on the Chinese economy. Now, almost all discussions of the Chinese economy today in America's news media and what I get of the UK's news media, all of them are very kind of contemporaneous. Like, we're going to look at what's happening this week. And essentially, I try and take it back and go and look back at CCP history, but also imperial history. So I look in this section, I'm looking at the Great Leap Forward, the Song Dynasty reforms of Wang Anshi starting really in 1069, and then Han Wudi, the Han Dynasty Emperor Wu, and his kind of efforts at economic reform. And I guess you could say those start in, well, he takes over starting in 141 BC, but his reforms really don't kick in until around 119 BC. So just, like taking a step back and looking at these stories from a broader perspective.
And does fiction enter into the picture as well as the history?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I in that economics chapter, I am looking at some of the poetry and some of the other works of literature that are associated with those particular events. So Mao actually writes quite a bit of poetry.
Oh, yeah.
Some of it on the Great Leap Forward, or some of it kind of touching on the Great Leap Forward. These kind of countryside poets are producing doggerel that is essentially just kind of rhymes making fun of leaders. So there's one, we don't fear the earth, we don't fear the sky, we only fear officials' lies. This is, during the Great Leap Forward, as they're starving to death, they kind of come up with these poems. But also, Wang Anshi in the 1069 Song Dynasty reforms, Wang Anshi is the head of the government for a while. He's a major poet. Pretty much everybody in that government is themselves an important poet. So you've got Su Dongpo, Sima Guǎng, just some really stunning poetry actually about economics.
I feel that the UK could do well with some more poets in the government rather than the I don't know what I would call them, the unliterary figures we have right now. My intro to the concept of Mao Zedong as a poet came pretty early, my time in China. So the town I was in was not the most thrilling town, but it was quite near the mountain of Muoganshan, which has a crazy history and has had visits from Mao and also Chiang Kai-shek. But I was going there's like a winding mountain road that you take to enter Muoganshan's sort of town on the mountain if you're going by bus or by car. And I guess that's an old road because a friend in town who was on I think in the car or on the bus, I don't remember, with me, told me that Mao had written a poem which mentions the 100 bends or the 50 bends in the road up Muoganshan. And I was like, interesting. I would not have predicted that, but I guess it's common knowledge if Chinese lit from the CCP era is your thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know that particular poem.
I don't know. But he wrote so many poems, and it just, yeah.
I would imagine any national leader would have potential as a travel poet just by virtue of the job. If you're head of state, you've got to be making some trips.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even before he was a national leader, when he was just the head of the CCP and the CCP was, kind of stuck in the armpit of China, he was writing poetry and he was kind of cultivating this sense that he was this, I'm going to use this word cautiously, but I'm going to use it anyways. He was a kind of Confucian poet emperor in the making. I think that there are lots of problems with calling Mao a Confucian, but I think it kind of works. I mean, Chiang Kai-shek, I don't think he wrote poetry. There is an economic book that he claimed to have written or that is attributed to him, but it's I sincerely doubt he actually wrote much of it. It was probably ghostwritten. But Mao himself, for everything nasty you can say about him, he wrote some poetry, and it was decent.
Right. There's a whole other episode worth discussion there, but I'll keep us moving. We're going to be talking about a little poem called Bonnie Prince Tuan. And normally on this podcast, we look at stuff in English that has been translated from Chinese. I almost never break that rule, but I think we are kind of maybe possibly breaking that rule this time. We don't
actually know this poem, we don't know if it was originally written in Chinese. Like, we just don't have that much evidence. So we can kind of fudge it and say, you don't know whether or not you're breaking that rule.
Yeah, plausible deniability is very important in politics. So I'm glad we've got that.
Are we getting back to UK politics then?
There's a lot of plausible... we had Boris as leader. So yeah, everything's about deniability. And now we've got one of his acolytes. So the plausible deniability never ends. Could you tell the listeners what this poem is?
So it's really, really weird, first off. It is a poem by a guy named Hongming. He is a Qing official, but he was born in Penang, which is, at the time, British colonial territory in modern-day Malaysia. He's educated in Edinburgh, and he writes this poem for the Empress Dowager Cixi's 66th birthday. So that should be, if my calculations are correct, around 1901. It's a poem written, at least the English version that we have, that's the only version that I have been able to find. It's written to sound Robert Burns-like, as if it's a Scottish ballad. And again, it's the version that we have is written in English. It's based on a Scottish ballad called The Bonnie Dundee. The poem is not... Do you know that poem? I mean, do you know that that ballad?
Keep going. I will spout when it's my turn, but keep going.
The poem is not titled in the one source where I have been able to find it, but just for ease of reference, I'm just going to call it the Bonnie Prince Tuan, because that phrase is repeated again and again. It takes this figure whose name is Prince Tuan, or today in modern pinyin, it would be spelled D-U-A-N, but back in the day it was spelled T-U-A-N. He's a Qing dynasty royal. His given name is Zai Yi. He's a Manchu. He's really famous as a leader, one of the Qing leaders of the Boxer Rebellion, which was an anti-foreign movement in China from, we'll say, 1899 to really 1901. The Boxers thought that the reason that China was in the dumps at the time, in the late Qing, was because foreigners were coming in, building railroads that were throwing off the country's feng shui. They were building churches that were blocking off the sky and not allowing the sky gods to let it rain, that sort of thing. And it was these hairy barbarians were converting the Chinese to this barbaric religion called Christianity. The Boxers were a group of kind of local martial artists. They kind of formed small groups, and they trained in martial arts. They thought that these martial arts were sort of magical. They believed that if they practiced well enough, they wouldn't be killed by bullets. Bullets couldn't hurt them. And the Boxers kind of became this giant mob, which responded to anti-foreign sentiments in China at the time by murdering foreign missionaries and their Christian converts. And they attacked foreigners. Most famously, they put the foreigners in Beijing under siege for about 55 days. It's really weird because this poem is incredibly strange because the Boxers are anti-foreign. And yet Gu Hongming writes this poem for Cixi, and Empress Dowager Cixi is sympathetic to the Boxers. He writes it in at least the version we have is in English, in a Scottish style. And it kind of takes this figure of Prince Tuan and it makes him into this Bonnie Prince Charles figure, which... Can you say more about like why this is so crazy?
Okay, I would argue it's not as crazy as it seems. Yeah, so my disclaimer right off the top, I probably know more about the history of the development of Chinese literature than I do Scottish literature, to be honest. My knowledge of the Scottish writers that are relevant here is patchy, very patchy. Same with my knowledge of the Jacobites, Bonnie Dundee and Bonnie Prince Charles. I know a fair bit, been to real historical sites, battlegrounds. We did the second Jacobite rebellion in primary school, but I'm far from an expert, so anything I say is probably worth fact-checking or patching together with some time on Wikipedia. So I'm glad you mentioned that this is based off another poem, because I didn't really do much prep. That is really good to know. So I thought I might read this thing first and then read an excerpt of what it's based on so that the listeners know what we're talking about before I start rattling through Scottish history. So here we go. To the Lords of Convention was third time lucky. To the Lords of Convention, 4th time lucky. To the Lords of Convention, 'twas Prince Tuan who spoke. Ere the king's crown go down, there are crowns to be broke. Then each Boxer lad who loves fighting and fun, let him follow the bonnets of bonny Prince Tuan. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle my horses and call out my men. Unfurl the banner and let fire the gun, for it's up with the bonnets of bonny Prince Tuan. Prince Tuan he is mounted, he rides up the street. The yells they shout backward, the drums they are beat. But Li Hung Chang, douce man, said, "Oh, please, Sir Man, we will try to get rid of that deal with Prince Tuan. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can. Come saddle my horses and call out my men. Unfurl the banner and let fire the gun, for it's up with the bonnets of bonny Prince Tuan. There are lands beyond Shense and hills beyond Sichuan. If there are Changs in Hubei, then there are Leos of Hunan. There are brave millions 400, and one will cry, hey for the bonnets of bonny Prince Tuan. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can. Come saddle my horses and call out my men. Unfurl the banner and let fire the gun, for it's up with the bonnets of bonny Prince Tuan. Then away to the hills, to the lee, to the rocks. Ere I own a usurper, I'll crouch with the fox. And tremble, ye deals, in the midst of your glee. Ye hae no seen the last of my bonnets and me. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can. Come saddle my horses and call out my men. Unfurl the banner and let fire the gun, for it's up with the bonnets of bonny Prince Tuan. I think this is really good. I was about to swear there, but I'll just say it's really flipping good. But that's because I think it's a pretty close crib of the source material with some words changed. I'm looking at the poem Bonnie Dundee. I'll just read a few verses so that readers can get the idea. Listeners, so that listeners can get the idea. Chabudoa, exactly. Dweida. To the lords of convention, 'twas clavers who spoke, ere the king's crown shall fall, there are crowns to be broke. So let each cavalier who loves honour and me come follow the bonnet of bonny Dundee. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle your horses and call up your men. Come open the Westport and let me gae free, it's room for the bonnets of bonny Dundee. Dundee he is mounted, he rides up the street. The bells are rung backward, the drums they are beat. But the Provost douce man said, just e'en let him be. The good town is weel quit of that deal Dundee. And so on. So I think this may not be a translation. Yeah, I think it's a translation in the sense that he's adapted it from Scots to another slightly less Scots. Right, so history, what the hell's going on? Bonnie Dundee was the leader of what's known as the First Jacobite Rising, or the First Jacobite Rebellion, and to put it as simply as I can, those were rebellions led by Highlanders, so not just by the Scots, not all the Scottish army, not the Scottish government army, but a rebel army of the Highlanders, who are the last, or were the last clan society in Europe, and have been sort of left out of the industrialization, or not industrialization, like the sort of modernization that was going on in modern Scotland and modern England. Around this time, big changes had happened in the monarchy that ruled over Scotland and England. I think at this time, this is where I'm fuzzy, is where the governments of Scotland and England joined, because the unification of the crowns happened long before the unification of Scotland and England's governments, if that makes sense.
It was James the First. After Elizabeth died, James the First was the king.
Yeah, that was the
right.
Bingo. That was the union of the crowns when Scotland and England's monarchies merged, but the governments didn't merge until, and that's where I'm fuzzy, maybe 100 or 200 years later. And I think this is around that sort of period of upheaval. But the other big upheaval here is, I guess, this is where my history's patchy, but basically the monarchy has switched permanently to, it's away from the Stuarts. The Stuart family, who were, this is the interesting thing, when the Scottish and the English thrones merged, it was the Scottish kings and queens who took it. Of course, they became anglicised immediately. So the Stuart family, which I'm a part of, became the monarchs. They were very Frenchified. That's why that spelling of Stuart switched to S-T-U-A. So there was these sort of Catholic monarchs, very French-influenced, European mainland-influenced Catholic, Scottish-influenced Catholic monarchs ruling the throne. But I guess around the time of the Civil War and the Charles I and II, they were replaced by William and Mary, these Dutch, relatives, monarchs who came over and made the throne Protestant, which it is today, which tells you who won out in the end. So around this time, you have the Jacobite rebellions, which are, I guess, a confluence of influences. So one would be the Highlanders, trying to fight for their place, but another would be the sort of romantic movement and a romantic push to bring back these Catholic Stuart monarchs. So it's all quite messy, and it doesn't necessarily neatly translate into Scotland versus England. I know at the conclusive battle of, I said I would make this brief, I'm failing amazingly. The last battle of the Second Jacobite Rebellion that ended things for good, there was more Scots on the side of the British government, the London government, if you like, than there were on the Jacobite side. And there were Scots and English on the government side, and I'm sure there would have been some English on the Jacobite side who were fighting for the cause.
Angus, can I ask a question?
Go for it.
So you said that it's not a purely England versus Scotland thing, but today,
No.
and when Gu Hongming is writing, it was read as an England versus Scotland, a kind of like modern versus anti-modern kind of thing, right?
Yeah, this is where the romanticism, I mean, it is broadly true. If you were to cartoon it, that is not a bad way to paint with a broad brush. But the romanticism really feeds in here, because the Jacobite cause was a romantic cause. Like, they weren't communist revolutionaries. They were fighting to replace the monarch with a different monarch. So it's maybe not the noble cause that of Scottish independence that, say, William Wallace and Robert the Bruce had fought for centuries before. This one, looking back from what you might call like a liberal Western perspective, feels a bit more silly and wasteful. But of course, as a Scottish person, you might be inclined to feel proud about it. But anyway, I mentioned romanticism because the author who wrote the poem Bonnie Dundee is Sir Walter Scott, who was one of the biggest name in a movement of authors who were writing these romantic novels, which were often using the Scottish Highlands as their source, because it's this very romantic thing, this traditional heroic culture that's fighting for its place but is going to lose. Nothing more romantic than a doomed cause.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be romantic to take the side of the nicely uniformed, disciplined British armies. That's not cool. Whereas it's much more cool to root for the young woman waving goodbye to her lover somewhere in the glens as he goes off to take on the government. So you can maybe see where the parallel with the Boxers is coming in, where it's a countryside doomed rebellion. It's not exactly a rational rebellion if it's about feng shui violations, but similarly there are real violations there. The violation of their land, their culture by imperial forces. And I don't know if you could really call the encroachment of modern society on the Highlands imperialism, but you could probably file it under some similar category of like encroachment.
I actually would say imperialism is such a protean category that I think you totally can.
You could spin it that way. Yeah, I think. It's worth saying as well, they had a Gaelic Celtic culture, which it still exists in parts of Scotland, but that's often because of government support. After the Second Jacobite Rebellion was defeated, I believe tartan, bagpipes, and Gaelic were outlawed. So it's maybe no surprise that those are such a big thing in the imaginary Scotland and Highlands that comes later in the writings of people like Walter Scott. That culture, which had in the past been crushed, was brought back into the literature as an amazing sort of selling point. The Highlanders were later... Sorry, go on.
I should just say, so my dad is... he's a McDonald on one side of his family, and he has this...
Right.
He has this kind of... I don't know if it's infatuation is too strong of a word, but he very much kind of adores Scottish culture.
Americans are known for this.
Yes, it's a thing. Like there's a Scottish festival everywhere. I don't know if Angus. Can't remember if I told you this, but Oregon actually has a town named Burns after Robert Burns. And the high school is called the Highlanders. That's their mascot. I was just there a couple of months ago. Actually, it's in the middle of nowhere. I assume that it would be very difficult for most of your listeners to get there, but it's there's some interesting hiking and mountains out that way.
Awesome. This is brilliant because this is what I was getting to. The Highlanders were later dealt an economic blow, I guess basically partly by the arrival of capitalism replacing feudalism, but also the fact that their lords and ladies were way down in London. So the clan leaders, who were the traditional leaders of Highland society, became absorbed into the... I think just absorbed into the sort of aristocratic but increasingly capitalistic ruling class in London. So what happened was their farming cottages were replaced with like sheep farming done by landowners. So what I think at the time was quite a large population in the north of Scotland was forced off the land, and being, it's not exactly welfare state Britain, they've just got nowhere to go. So that's why there are so many people of Scots ancestry in the States, but especially Canada. There was a huge wave across the Atlantic at that time, and that was sort of the final nail in the coffin of Highlands culture, because their language, Gaelic, which, if I'm being technical, if you say Gaelic, it technically means the Irish version. Gaelic is technically the Scottish version. That had already been crushed culturally, and now the population itself left. So Highland culture in Scotland mostly exists these days as tourism. Little tartan hats you buy in Edinburgh, which is far from the Highlands. And Gaelic does still exist, but it's more or less on life support. Contrast that with Ireland, where Irish Gaelic is still a thing. The reason I'm bringing up the Romanticism is that's the bleeding figure of that is Walter Scott, and our guy Hongming, he must have been influenced by that literary movement while he was in Edinburgh, because that's the writer he's chosen to crib for his poem about the Boxers.
Can I ask, so you know way more about Scottish history than I do, and we were talking about this in kind of in emailing back and forth. Do you think that this comparison works for you in terms of from a Scottish perspective?
It's not one for one, obviously not, but I don't think it's invalid either. Like, I think the fact that the Boxers were initially going up against the Chinese government, the imperial government, is not a bad parallel at all with the Jacobites, because they initially, I guess they completely were. Although maybe the difference is they had aristocratic leaders, whereas I guess the Boxers, they later got support, too late, from Cixi, the Empress, but from what I understand, they were quite grassroots.
Yeah, very much grassroots, and
but yeah,
when I looked at some of the best study on kind of literature and history around the Boxers is Paul Cohen's History in Three Keys, and it's interesting because he makes the observation that the Boxers have been viewed differently at different points in history, like completely differently. They've been viewed as kind of the scum of the earth and the salt of the earth. But initially, you have very much the Chinese elites who are looking down on the Boxers. And someone did a survey of 5,000 poems written during the Boxer Rebellion or shortly thereafter. And they concluded that 90% of these poems were negative. Now, I don't know how you come up with those numbers, but definitely it's being perceived in a negative fashion.
Right. I can think of a few more parallels. So one would be related to the fact it's a peasant uprising is equipment. So the Jacobites or the Jacobite soldiers were Highland soldiers. So they're famous for wearing their plaids, just like tartan fabric, into battle. Their one thing they did have, supposedly, was the traditional two-handed sword, the claymore. So you might have a bayonet on the end of your gun, but if I come at you with a claymore, then, assuming I don't miss, then there's going to be two smaller pieces of you, and I'll be fine. So yeah, they were scary. I think that they were famous for their charge, the Highland charge. That was something through history that the Highlanders had that the other people of Scotland, like myself, an East Coaster, wouldn't have had. So they have this military prowess, but also in a formal battle against a better provisioned opponent, like the British government troops, they would really need, like a flat field battle. They're not going to win. The Battle of Culloden, that one I mentioned, where there was more Scots on the government side, the government troops started the day with a full bowl of porridge and maybe some meat or some cheese or something. And the Jacobite soldiers started the day on a cup of water and a couple of oatcakes, tiny little biscuits. So, yeah, there's that parallel. Another might be how well they did before losing. So if I understand correctly, the Boxers actually captured Tianjin before they got purged. Is that right?
I believe they captured it for a bit, but then
right.
Tianjin became the port which the eight nation alliance kind of took over and began their invasion from. And I think the Boxers captured Tianjin, but Tianjin, because it's on the coast there, it's so hard to defend if you've got these giant battleships just willing to shell the heck out of them. So it was kind of a hopeless capture, if I remember correctly.
Right. Yeah. So the Jacobites in both their risings, I believe, gave quite a solid kick to the hornet's nest at the very least before getting stopped. So the first leader of the first rising, that's Bonnie Dundee, the guy that Walter Scott's poem is about, and that's the poem that I keep getting mixed up whether it's Gu Hongming or Gu Hongming, not Hu Gongming. That's my brain really wants to say the other wrong one every time.
It makes sense,
Bonnie
right?
Dundee's
Hu is a much more common last name.
Right. Yeah. So Bonnie Dundee is most famous for a victory, not a defeat. That was at Killiecrankie, which is a very uneven landscape. It's probably why the Jacobites won there. But he also died there. I think he got shot somewhere on the sides or near the end of the battle. Right? Yeah, very romantic. There's also an amazing spot at Killiecrankie called Soldier's Leap, where it's like a big gap between two rocks over a drop and then some water. And I think the water is deep enough that if you drop down, you won't get hurt. And that at that spot, the legend goes, a government soldier was fleeing the Jacobites, and he leapt right over the little gorge to the other rock in an almost superhuman leap. So it's also very romantic, and it's romanticism on both sides as well. It's sort of an ambivalence there, where you have the baddie or the nominal baddie does something heroic that has been remembered. Yeah, so I don't know exactly what led to the downfall of Bonnie Dundee, but that one fizzled out. And then the second rebellion was a much more... that one's remembered. That's the Bonnie Prince Charlie rebellion. Bonnie Prince Charlie's a bigger deal than Bonnie Dundee. He was one of the exiled... Well, I don't know how exiled he was. I think, yeah, he was exiled. He was living in France. So he'd lived a life of, kind of wealthy dejection in mainland Europe. So a bit like Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons from Game of Thrones, but he wasn't living in poverty. So he comes back and kicks off a rising, and I think has a reasonable amount of fanfare. And I believe he won pretty much every battle until his last one. And he didn't just fight in Scotland. He went south of the border, and I think was in striking distance of London when, against the advice of his advisors, he turned around and went back to Scotland, and that's where he lost at Culloden, finally. So, yeah, these sort of doomed leaders. He's I think supposedly he was handsome, he was young, he was brave. Whether we believe that or not, you decide. I mean, the other narrative would say he had no good reason to come back. He barely spoke. I think, English and Scots were not his first language. He got a lot of people killed, and he died in comfort in Rome much later, age 67. So, yeah, you can read these events in history a few different ways, but if you're trying to write a good, stirring poem, you'll probably pick the first option.
And it's like you said, it's kind of the cartoon version of history. England versus Scotland, modern versus kind of pre-modern. The Battle of the Boyne in Ireland is similarly famous as this kind of England versus Ireland, Catholic versus Protestant. But actually, it's much more complicated. The Pope was actually supporting the Protestants against there's just all kinds of stuff. And I think that same thing is true in the Boxers. You can read, there's no right way to read the Boxers, but you really have to be careful because any clear choice of these guys were good or these guys were bad is going to be like easily kind of brushed aside because like they were fighting imperialism, but they were also murdering random people for religious choices.
Yeah, there's an exciting way to read history, and then there's maybe a right way, and it's hard to have both. I'm actually reading Mo Yan's book Sandalwood Death just now, and that's kind of about the Boxer Rebellion, but it allows itself to be ambivalent by not actually being about the Boxers. It's set during those events, and they inform the drama. So that's, I guess, a good way to do a historical novel. Is you don't need to go for the big juicy target like Gu Hongming has done in this one, Bonnie Prince Tuan. I don't know if I got much more to say about the history. Do you have anything you'd add?
Not really, no. I think you covered all the bases. All
right. I believe you had a question for me about how Scottish this poem sounds.
Yeah, so I was at a think tank in DC, and I met a guy from, hang on, I'm going to say it correctly, Orkney, not the Orkneys, right? It's Orkney.
There are a few different isles that make up Orkney, so you could say the Orkney Isles or you could say Orkney. I think both would be right.
So because he told me he would punch me if I put the definite article. No, he didn't. He's quite a nice guy, but he said, say Orkneys or Orkney. So he's
saying Orkney is, you could say Orkney or you could say the Orkney Isles.
Okay.
Don't fudge it halfway and say the Orkneys.
Okay. So he was from Orkney, and he said that this poem was actually just kind of, it was not at all, there was nothing Scottish about it. How Scottish does it feel to you? Because when you read comparing the Hongming and the Bonnie Dundee, it sounded really similar to me, but that's completely out of my wheelhouse.
Right. I can see what he's saying because there are not many Scots words in Gu Hongming's rendering. Most, like 95% of it reads as plain English, whereas so I inflected my accent / a stronger version of my accent into some of the lines. Like instead of with, I was going into a bit more of like we, things like that. Bonnie Dundee definitely has some Scots words in it, deal is actually in both of them. That means devil. What else have we got? Coothie. That's terrible. I should know what Coothie means. Coothie and slee, so like cunning and sly. Deuce means sweet. I didn't know that. I had to check that. So there's the Walter Scott one, to be honest, is not as Scots as it could be either. A Burns poem might read as a bit more Scots, I think. And the Gu Hongming one, even less so. But I think not everything is in the words. I'm just going to see how many of the sort of Scots words I can spot in this one. So we had deuce. Sir Man kind of sounds Scots, I'm not sure. Deal, that's definitely a Scots version of devil.
We've mentioned Robert Burns a couple of times. Should we remind the listener who, that they have obviously heard a Robert Burns poem, because everyone on the planet has heard a Robert Burns poem, right?
Yeah, they love, in China, they love Auld Lang Syne.
Yeah.
But they don't all know it's Scottish. So I can make this one a personal anecdote. So when I lived in Edinburgh, I was somehow on relatively cheap rent in the centre of the city in a close, which is like a courtyard in a flat there. And our close was connected with the next one down, and in that next one down was the Writers, I think it's just called the National Writers Museum or something, and it's a small thing in this quirky old town Edinburgh house. And it's not about all the writers of Scotland or all the writers of Edinburgh. It's devoted to three of them. Walter Scott, who wrote Bonnie Dundee, that Bonnie Prince Tuan is based on. Robert Louis Stevenson of Treasure Island fame. He was from Edinburgh, or at least he was Scottish, and he had a granddad in Edinburgh. and Robert Burns, who's the national poet, basically. If you were to ask me who's the Lushun of Scotland, I would probably say Robbie Burns, not Walter Scott, because Robbie Burns had some feet on the ground. As well as being more famous, he had much more of a working man's perspective. I guess there was some romanticism in his poems, but Walter Scott is, I think, much more concerned with big sweeping vistas and romantic, great big novels, whereas Robbie Burns, it's more earthy. So he would be more of a Lucian, I think.
And he doesn't have Walter Scott doesn't have a town in Oregon named after him.
He might have a town somewhere. Dundee, the city of Dundee, where I'm from, is apparently one of 6 in the world. So thank you, colonialism, for that one. I've actually been to one of the other ones in Nova Scotia, Latin for New Scotland, in Canada. There's a little, it's like a house or a little eatery and like a swamp or something. That's from what I remember. That's Dundee, Canada.
I've actually been to the Writers' Museum there in Edinburgh.
Huh.
It was nice.
There
I
you
liked
go.
it. Yeah.
Free as well. Right. I'll stop trying to catch all the Scots words in this thing and just say the thing I hadn't got to is that I think in its rhythm and its spirit, it does feel quite Scottish to me, or at least the romantic packaged version of what passes for Scottish in kind of default culture within Scotland and abroad. It's got that rousing feeling, throw up your bonnets, and I think it's there because it's been inherited from the Bonnie Prince Dundee, or the Bonnie Dundee poem, but also because I think Hongming got the spirit. I think his time in Edinburgh as a literati probably means he understood how you write a rousing Scottish poem. He's used some Scots words, but I don't know. I don't think the lack of Scots words makes it not Scottish. I don't know what other points of criticism your friend had.
I don't really. I don't think his criticism was particularly. He didn't lay it out for me, but he just said he didn't think it was Scottish. But then again, I mean, Hongming is studying in Edinburgh. They don't really speak Scott. They don't. You know that Edinburgh has a complicated relationship with the Scottish identity. Am I correct?
Yes and no. I think living there, yeah, it's the least Scottish city in Scotland.
And it's also the most, right?
It's the capital. It's
right.
The national capital. Yeah. That's probably true for most national capitals, though, in a globalized world. It's not unique to Scotland.
Sure.
But yeah, it's traditionally quite anglicised. There's the most famous Scottish philosopher, David Hume, was an Edinburgh guy, and I think he, at some point in his career, went on to write History of England, which tells you what you need to know. And it's also a seat of Scottish romanticism, which on one hand is a great national tradition, on the other hand is kind of the victors of history, the lowlanders, making up the history of the losers, the Highlanders. And if we're going way back in history, that side, the south east of Scotland, was an English or Anglo kingdom for quite a while. It was part of Northumbria. Whereas the northwest of England was part of Strathclyde, a Celtic, proto-Scottish kingdom. So again, it's all very messy. Like Scots as a language is, I think you'll usually hear people say it's an English dialect. Probably my more nationalistic compatriots or people academically invested might tell you that actually Scots and English are siblings. One is not the progeny of the other. They both have their roots in Germanic language. Like there are words in Scotland that I might use, like kirkyard, which would be churchyard, and that shows its Germanic roots right away because the German for church is kirk. It's the same word. Right. There are bits of ancient Germanic language which are better preserved in Scots than modern English, because I guess Scots was handed down traditionally rather than in the the proverbial textbooks. And then within Scotland as well, though, you have Gaelic. You have a purely Celtic, or Gaelic rather, a purely Celtic language.
Which is,
I guess the difference is
it's a totally different
Gaelic,
language group, right? Like it's not even.
Yes.
It's not even closely related.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about it's more different than English and French.
Yeah, it's easier for me to learn any Central or Western European language than it is to learn Gaelic or Gaelic. Because, yeah, they are somewhere on the same tree, but
Sure.
they're very distant. Yes, so Gaelic is almost a dead language, and I guess has maybe moved with the times a bit, whereas Scots has evolved. Like if you read an Irving Welsh novel like Trainspotting, you'll be reading the Scots of the 80s, and in Edinburgh Scots of the 80s. So it's a very Scottish way of talking, but it's not illegible for someone down in England who reads it closely and maybe checks a few of the words.
Since we're talking about kind of parallels between Scotland and China, would you say that Scots might be parallel to like Cantonese, the way it functions in Hong Kong? I mean,
I'm really hesitant about all those analogies because we Scots love to think we're oppressed, but honestly, we're not that oppressed. I mean, the independence or not of the Scottish government is not as scary an issue as the ones Hong Kong and Taiwan face. So, and it's always just an analogy. Analogies they're better or worse, but they're never one for one. But yeah, like modern Scots is somewhere on the spectrum or relation. It's not an alien language to English like Gaelic is, and I guess you could say the same for Cantonese and Mandarin. So there's something there.
I like to say that analogies are good as teaching devices, but they never prove anything because you can always compare one thing to the next, and I think we're kind of testing some of that water. If we tried to prove anything with these analogies, it would fall apart. But it's good to like explain.
Yeah, I think they're a good starting point. If I was teaching a class of kids only with analogies, then I'd end up with a class of expert pseudo-intellectuals. Yeah, I don't know how much further I could take that one because I don't know much about Cantonese.
Fair enough.
So I will not bloviate further.
Did you want me to jump into some of the other questions?
Yeah, we should keep moving. I realize we've kind of covered the Jacobites and the Boxers. We've definitely done the potted history of them both. We've talked about analogies. So yeah, we can keep going. Next section I called the scattered remnants. First question in this category is about cross-pollination. This poem is obviously a really interesting example of that because we have a Chinese literati who went not just to the west but to Scotland and went back home, I think, but took a little piece of the place he visited with him, and that's me. That's why I'm doing this podcast, and I've written stories with strong Chinese elements or influences because I don't want to let it go. I can't let it go, and I like seeing where cross-pollination of those experiences and your own, your home country or your home life can go. I find it really interesting because it can produce strange mutant creatures. So, and I love seeing it in other literature, and I've seen it in the stuff I've read for this podcast. I do see it quite often, but it's not always as in your face as this poem. So I wanted to ask you, in Chinese lit you've read, are you struck by interesting cases of Chinese writers taking influences from like outside Han culture or from outside the borders?
Yeah, so it was done, but only very rarely before really the 1880s or 1890s is really when it got started. Before that, you'd have some examples of it, but it was very shallow, I guess is the right word. I don't want to sound pejorative, because I'm not saying it's a bad thing to be shallow, but it was very much kind of like the other was imagined, but it was just a stage on which or a screen on which you could project kind of discussions of Chinese society. So to give you an example, Li Zhen is the author of the novel 金华园, Flowers in the Mirror, and there's a 1965 translation of that novel into English. I don't know how good it is, but the novel itself is pretty crazy. It's a fantasy novel written in 1827. These female flower goddesses fall to earth from heaven. They take the bodies of men, and they're forced to travel from China to a bunch of different countries. It's kind of like it is very much a Jonathan Swift kind of adventure, where you're going to these different imaginary countries and criticizing things about China. So the most famous of these countries is the country of women. This is a country where, from the Qing perspective, things are topsy-turvy and women rule. And so these men, who are actually female goddesses, it's kind of confusing, they are forced into this submissive position. They are forced to get their ears pierced. Their feet are broken in order to fit into their shoes, which is an obvious critique of the Chinese practice of foot binding. It's very weird. It's like Gulliver's Travels, but with a very feminist twist. But like Gulliver's Travels, it's not really about a real foreign country. It's about, like, foreignness just becomes a kind of empty vessel into which you can pour ideas about China. Once you get to the 1890s, though, this cross-pollination really takes off. So one of the most famous books in the late 19th, early 20th century, just before the Qing fell, one of the most sold books in China is actually Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Harriet Beecher Stowe work. It's translated by Lin Shu, who's probably the most famous, one of the two most famous translators in the late Qing. Lin Shu doesn't speak English. He doesn't read English. What he does is he gets these normally these Chinese Christian converts to translate the book sort of into Chinese from English for him, and then he translates it into classical Chinese, Wenyan Wen. And the novel, he completely changes bits of it. So instead of being about Uncle Tom, it's actually about a character who's sort of a secondary character in the original novel, and this is about it's more about him going to Africa and kind of getting back and setting up a society and kind of finding freedom. And the novel's name itself, I think, is changed. It's more like, instead of Uncle Tom's Cabin, I think the Lin Shu's translation of the title is something like The Black Man Cries to Heaven, or something like that. And in the preface, Lin Shu is writing about this novel, and he's saying, look, these Western powerful countries are doing to China what they are doing to Indians and Poles and Iranians. If we, the yellow people, and that's his term, not mine, don't fight back, we will also be made into slaves, just like has happened to black folks. And so it's kind of a clarion call to get people to get the Chinese people to wake up. But it's also kind of a recipe for getting out of the Western countries' hegemony. So that's a good example, but there are lots of examples of cross-pollination happening in the 1890s and the 1900s. Of course, we have to mention Lu Xun, right? Diary of a Madman. It's originally inspired by a Gogol novel from Russia of the same name, though.
Yeah.
Have you read the Gogol novel?
It's on my list, but it's been on my list for years now. I've not read any Gogol.
I read it like a decade ago. It's not as good as Lu Xun.
Chalk up one for China then.
There you go. So I mean,
suck it, Russia.
The cross-pollination thing, it sounds negative to say they're copying something. That's necessarily a pejorative thing, but I don't think it has to be. There are people who make they take the original and make it better, right?
Yeah, I say this as a guy who writes 2 email newsletters for every week for his job. Copying and pasting and then adapting is an art form, and it can produce wonderful fruits. So yeah, I don't think that it is anything. Maybe we can say that Bonnie Prince Tuan is not as original as the poem Bonnie Dundee, but there's no reason we couldn't say it's, if you got something out of it, if, for example, you are, for some reason, fascinated by points where Scotland and China converge. I can't think of anyone like whose boxes that would tick. Definitely no one on this call. If that's what you like, then of course you're going to prefer Bonnie Prince Tuan to Bonnie Dundee.
Yeah. It's
maybe less original, but for a reader like that, the Chinese product is much more fun.
Yeah, there's something about twisting the narrative that I think I like the Bonnie Prince Tuan better than Bonnie Dundee. But, you know, all due respect to my Scottish nationalist friends, they're both interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I had a thought. What was it? Yeah, I was just going to rattle off like some products of cultural cross-pollination I've covered on the show that I think are just cool. Chinese sci-fi is, that's a massively obvious one. Not just for like the crass reason that, sci-fi is a Western invention and the Chinese writers have adopted it. I mean, you could make that argument, but I think it's more interesting to look at the authors who are like Chinese writers have talked about having been influences. Like Liu Cixin talked a lot about being inspired by Arthur C. Clarke, and you certainly hear other. I've heard other Chinese sci-fi writers talk about Clarke as being a huge influence. But then there's less obvious stuff, like I know from having covered her that San Shui thinks Kafka is like the greatest writer ever, and is trying to channel Kafka. And like that, I think that is an interesting one, because she's channeling out of Kafka a thing I don't think he's famous for in the popular imagination. People think of him as being the guy who writes about awful bureaucracy and existential absurdity. But it's also true that a lot of his stories create a weird backwards world where that seems like it might be some stranger plane of existence that is like ours but slightly removed. And that's seems to be what San Shui is channeling, if it's anything of Kafka. So it's not just that she's cross-pollinated from him, but she's drawn out something that I wouldn't have thought of looking for in Kafka.
So mentioning other folks that you've covered on your podcast, you did Lust Caution with Claire Howe.
Zhang Ailing Chang with Claire, yeah.
So she wrote a work, Zhang Ailing wrote a work called 多少恨, which is kind of based off of Jane Eyre. So that's, another example. I mean, it's not completely a copy. And honestly, I'm not a fan of the Bronte sisters. So I adore Zhang Ailing. So I not surprisingly think 多少恨 is better than the original, but that's just a good example of cross-pollination.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you as well about depictions of the boxers in literature. So you mentioned that in the writing at the time, it was overwhelmingly negative. I've covered the boxers, I think, or I've covered a book that covered the boxers, I think, just once on the show, I think. And that was, two, and they're both by the Tianjin writer Feng Jicai. His Faces in the Crowd, it's the English translation's name, that has one of its little vignette stories has a female detachment of rebel soldiers show up in the city. But then A Looking Glass World, again the English translation title, that's about a doomed romance that happens during the boxer capture of Tianjin, which is how I know they captured Tianjin briefly. And now I'm reading that Mo Yan book I mentioned, Sandalwood Death, which is set amidst all that hurly-burly. So I just wanted to ask, like, aside from reading up on the literary coverage, poetic coverage at the time, like, what, in your studies and in your reading, where have the Boxers popped up? In fiction and lit, that is.
So pretty much every time the Boxers pop up, they're like a response to the changes that are happening on the ground in Chinese politics at the time, and really have nothing to do with the Boxers themselves. So the Chen Dushou actually is one of the first people. Chen Dushou is one of the first people to kind of romanticize the Boxers. He says they are a kind of anti-imperialist rebels, and Chen Dushou is writing just a couple of years after probably 2 decades after the Boxers. Chen Dushou is, of course, one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party. He is one of the leaders of the May 4th movement. So he's a very influential figure, and he takes up the Boxers' cause to a certain degree. At the same time, his former friend and sort of guy leaning towards America, Hu Shi, is pretty anti-Boxer. He kind of views them as this rabble-rousing group of unwashed masses that are that it's not really that big of a deal that they were all killed off. Again and again, you have this kind of dual perspective on the Boxers. When the communists take over, the Boxers become this this anti-imperialist peasant mob that, although I think that people, in the CCP writing in the 1950s would have said they were channeling their energies the wrong way, they were kind of perceived also as forerunners of the communists. The communists took that anti-imperialist energy and they got it into the right channel, a constructive channel that is the CCP. But in the 1980s, you have this move away again from the Boxers as being good, and a move towards the Boxers being this kind of the unwashed masses. Liu Xinwu, who's one of the first really big post-Mao writers, writes a semi-fictional account in 1985 of Chinese rioters. They riot after the loss of the Chinese soccer team to the Hong Kong soccer team, and Liu portrays the rioters as if they're Boxers, and he does it in a negative way. So that's kind of a really modern interpretation or reinterpretation of the Boxers. Again, it has almost nothing to do with the Boxers themselves. It's the Boxers as a symbol. 1989, you've got the Chinese government who feels that it's being bullied by foreigners who are sanctioning them just for, quote unquote, keeping the peace. That's how the Beijing feels, and they again throw out the Boxers as a symbol of victims of foreign oppression. So there's this kind of back and forth that relates to the politics of the day that throws the Boxers up as a pretty powerful signal of certain things.
Yeah, that book I mentioned a minute ago, A Looking Glass World, the Feng Chi one, that was an interesting one for me, because working with Sinoist Books, I helped out with the production of that book. And when you're doing production, you kind of want to just focus on the story. Like if you're picking a font and having input into the cover design, you don't want to bring in the modern day politics. And for translated literature, it's especially fiddly, because the book was from a few years ago. I think it was one of the newer Feng novels, but he had written it at one instance of modern Chinese relationship with the outside world, and we were publishing it later when the relationship had got worse, I guess. So on one hand, you want to, you're not the academic, you're not the reviewer. It's not your job to interpret and bring in the modern politics. But you also got to write the blurb. I was one of the I talked with Daniel Lee when I had him on. Me and him pretty much wrote that blurb together with some input from the editor. And you do want to kind of try and hint at the metaphorical wider significance of the story, but also it's not it's written to be a good story as well, and you've got to sell that in the blurb. So yeah, it was just an interesting way of dipping my toes into those uses of history in the literature. I don't think I got any other questions about the boxers for you. Are you good to move on to the next section?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, cool. So the next section is the miscellaneous section, and I always start this by asking if the guest would like to suggest a word of the day, a Chinese word of the day. I didn't actually prepare one myself, but what I'm going to do right now is look up the Mandarin word for Jacobite, because I think that would be very funny. But do you have any words?
So I was going to go with 广记不如淡墨. So the best memory is not as good as the palest ink. When we think about how the boxers are remembered, it's constantly shifting, and the sort of social memory of the boxers is changed again and again, and it's only really with historical records that we can go back and know what the boxers were or were not actually about. So there's this sense in trying to deal with the boxers that if you don't have something recorded from that time period, it's something written down or a photograph or whatever it is, then you're just constantly dealing with these kind of shifting mythologies.
That is a very good one. So I looked up how to say Jacobite, and pardon my murdering of the tones, but it's雅各布派.雅各布派doesn't really sound like Jacobite, but I realized it's pi as in like party or clique, so that works, I guess. So I guess Yagobu is like Jacobite, and then pi is the fact it's a movement, a somewhat political movement. I guess the first three characters are just phonetic. I'm guessing they don't have any relevance.
That is cool that they were able to integrate pi into that.
Yes. Which clique are you in? I'm in the Yagobu clique. You wouldn't have heard of it. Right. A piece of music. I did not prepare for this one, but I have thought of two musical pairings off the top of my head. But before I unload those, if you could set this poem to a piece of music, perhaps for a reading, perhaps for the movie adaptation, where all the boxers are wearing plaid, what would it be?
I struggled with this, but I'm going to go with Enter the Haggis, their song "Ride My Monster," which is a kind of folksy, fun song about a guy who grows up with his monster from the loch. I don't think the song explicitly says it, but it's
Nessie.
It's Nessie, yeah. I just kind of thinking of the Scottish elements of the song and how it starts out kind of slow and then kind of amps up into this cheering anthem. It seems
Enter the Haggis.
Into the Haggis.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And now I am a big strapping man, and soon we go and I go riding every chance we can, and together we three rode the swells, and one day we have the wedding bells.
Fantastic.
Had you not heard of them?
Nope.
Oh man.
No, I somehow managed to avoid that. I was speaking of cultural cross-pollination. Daniel Lee of Cinemas Books I'm talking about, he messaged me recently some TikTok clip of a Scottish Indian wedding, which he thought was very amusing. And to me, it's not that crazy because we have a fair number of South Asian Indian people in Scotland.
Yeah.
But I said, yeah, India and Scotland is a very powerful combination. And he said, yeah, curried haggis, that would be pretty good, right? And I thought, yeah, curried haggis would be good, but we do have a Scottish Indian dish. It's a chicken curry pie. It's quite good. If you're in Scotland, try and get a pie. Why the hell did I bring that up? I don't know.
Enter the haggis. Enter the haggis.
Enter that. Yes, that's it. Haggis. That was the link. Okay, so I've got 2 songs. I'm going to be self-indulgent and name them both. I think one I picked because it's Scottish and it's rousing. And it's like our national rock band these days, basically. Biffy Clyro. Have you heard of Biffy Clyro?
No.
No, I'm not sure how big they are. They're big in England and I guess all of the UK and maybe Ireland, but I don't know how big they are abroad. But in any case, they've got a song called The Wolves of Winter, which I think came out when Game of Thrones was at its peak of popularity. And it's kind of non-specific. It's just about sticking together and surviving, but it has a very rousing sort of quasi-military masculine feel to it. So I've got that. I'm going to make that down.
This is the point. We have the choice to survive the winter. We have achieved so much more than you possibly thought we could. You can achieve anything, just remember no I team. We are the wolves of winter. We live in a kingdom of blood.
And then the other one is not Scottish at all, but it is Celtic influenced. You might know this one. Shipping Off to Boston by... Oh, bugger, what are they called? Oh, that's terrible. I'm going to have to look this one up. I'm going to kick myself. Shipping Off to Dropkick Murphys, an American-Irish band. And I've picked that one because there's cultural hybridity. It's American-Irish. And it's used quite famously in the film The Departed by Martin Scorsese. So that's a real explosion of pollination, because that movie is a crib of Infernal Affairs, a Hong Kong cop movie. So we got America, Hong Kong.
Yep.
You know, Hong Kong is Chinese in some way. I'll let listeners decide in what way.
Delicately maneuver around that issue.
Yes. I'm not even going to use more words on that one. You got America, Ireland as well. But then Scorsese himself making a movie with American Irish characters is really interesting, because I think he made that one after or around the time he did Gangs of New York, which is also it's very much about American Irish people, but he himself is most famous. He's American Italian, and he's most famous for making films about Italian American mobsters, but he took an interest in the history and I guess present of the Irish Americans, because he saw that although they arrived in different periods of time, there was some common struggle and commonalities in the lives they lived as like an underclass. And that makes me think of what you said about the Chinese writer drawing attention to the fact that their experience as people on the receiving end of colonialism made them not so different from, I guess, the other people of the colonized world.
And they specifically saw themselves as like part of this global precariat at the time. They were trying to construct this shared community, which completely failed. But it was something that it is crazy that you go from, the 1850s where the Chinese, many of the Chinese think they're kind of the center of the universe, to the 1890s when they're seeing themselves in solidarity with people all around the world.
The other reason I picked Shipping Off to Boston is it's extremely rousing, just like Bonnie Prince Tuan. I'm definitely going to bat for Bonnie Prince Tuan and say it's really rousing. I enjoyed reading it a lot. And I thought, advertisement for the listeners, go listen to the episode Lee and his co-host Rob did on this poem. I don't think we've said that yet, but you've already covered this one on your show. And one of you did a reading, and I thought that was really good too.
Yeah, that was Rob. He's got to take all the credit for that. He I did not feel safe trying my horrible Scottish.
Yeah, Nicola Sturgeon does have a missile launch button pointed at America when someone messes up. No, I thought he did an accent, and I thought he did it very well. And I articulated, I hadn't thought about this before, but I had a co-worker, an English guy, a local, who had a go at doing what he thought was a Scottish accent, and I said, stop, you can't do that again. And he said, oh, so it's fine if you impersonate an English person, but English people, and I stopped and I said, no, it's fine because I can do a decent job of an English accent. You murdered your attempt at doing Scots. If our other pal had a go and he was good, he's in my books, he's fine.
Huh?
Because it's not like, I don't think it's a charge thing. We're not a colonized or oppressed people. So if someone can do a good Scottish accent, like what's his face? Who did Shrek? Scottish people don't hate Shrek because that's quite a good impression. And maybe it does use the trope of the angry man, the loud angry man. But there's a lot of loud angry men in Scotland. The one that is a bit shitty is Groundskeeper Willie in The Simpsons. But he's so ridiculous that he doesn't even feel like, he's not even, what am I trying to say?
It's so cartoonish, obviously, because it's a cartoon. And, yeah.
It's annoying when people use it as a reference, but on its own doesn't make me mad. But yeah, anyway, I thought Rob's reading was pretty solid.
That's good to hear. I was not going to wade into that water.
I would love to have gone back in time and hear Gu Lao Shi read it. That would have been interesting.
If we were there if we could have been flies on the wall in the Forbidden City with Empress Dowager Cixi and Gu Hongming.
Yeah, to hear Empress Cixi speak some Scots, that would have been something. Do you know if she spoke English or any foreign languages?
I don't think so. There are a couple of Qing officials. Prince Gong, I think, was one of them. Actually, no, sorry. So Prince Gong, I think, may have spoken English. I'm not 100% on that. But Cixi's, I forget what the relationship was, but the Guangxu emperor had studied some English. And Cixi had... Cixi, let me look back at my notes for this before I say something very stupid. Okay, so Cixi was the mother of the Tongzhi emperor, and the Tongzhi emperor came to the throne in 1861 when he was 5. He lasted until 1875. The official reason he died was smallpox, but rumors were circulating that he actually whored himself to death in the Beijing pleasure quarters. So as you can imagine, he didn't spend that much time ruling, but she eventually murdered his wife, and Cixi's very own, the wife was pregnant with her grandchild. And to maintain power, Cixi probably not murdered, had her commit suicide. So this was very much a power-hungry person. But the person that eventually got installed on the throne for her to keep power was the Guangxu emperor. The Guangxu emperor did speak English, and he tried to actually push Cixi out of power and have a government that was more open to foreign ideas. In 1898, that lasted 100 days, and then she crushed it and kept Guangxu in essentially a prison in the Forbidden City for the rest of his life. And right before she died, she had him poisoned. Probably, we don't know for sure. But anyway, she was very much resistant to foreign ideas. Though, I've seen pictures of her having these very kind of formal tea parties with British and American wives of ambassadors. So there, it wasn't like she didn't. She had never seen a foreigner. She had, but my understanding was she did not speak any English.
Right. Interesting. She actually appears as a character a couple times in Sandalwood Death. That's why she's on my mind.
Is Sandalwood Death? And I know you said that the kind of boxers are secondary to the rest of the novel, but does he express any perspective on the boxers, Mo Yan?
Yeah, I don't know if he expresses anything, because it's definitely a work of fiction, and it uses characters' POVs, and it switches between very close third person and first person, so it's hard to like extract what Mo Lao's point of view might be. There's a local rebellion that happens. So a town. It's set in Qingdao, in his Gaomi, like this place he sets all his novels. Mm-hmm. And at that time, they're in the Jiaoao colony, the German colony, mm-hmm. and so the Germans in their base in Qingdao are trying to build a railroad that's going to go through Gaomi. And without spoiling too much, that triggers a revolt. A survivor of an attack on a town by the Germans, a massacre, goes off for a chapter to get, trained, I guess, by the boxers. And he comes back, he adopts the persona of UFA, the general who fought the
Song Dynasty.
The Jin.
Yeah,
the Song general who fought the Jin. And he gets two sidekicks. One is dressed up as Sun Wukong, the Monkey King. And his other sidekick, you might be able to guess, has a rake. So he's Pigsy. Yeah. Zhu Bajia. So they lead a quite heroic but quite strange rebellion. The reason it's like that, I think, is because the leader, he's a recently retired Lao Sheng, like an old man Chinese opera player. There's a local form of opera in the book. I don't know if it's real. It's called Mao Qiang opera. And so it's a sort of Chinese opera style rebellion where the theatre is just as powerful as the strength, which I guess is sort of true for the boxers in a way, that they did have a performative element, and the true for the Jacobites too in a way. Maybe after the fact, they have this cultural, romantic power as well as their actual strength.
Yeah,
I was going to say this is just dragging things out, but when I was talking about how the Highland aesthetic has been, destroyed by the Lowland Scots and the English and then repackaged as our national identity. So a lot of people have heard of the kilt, the kind of men's skirt style thing that is supposed to be traditional Scottish dress. That is a creation of that sort of packaging. The clothes that the Highlanders wore were called plaids. So, just like Americans have plaid, it was this sort of checkered pattern, but it covered your whole body. So I think the woman wore it like, head to wherever, like a big dress, and the men would wear it, I think they'd throw it over the shoulder, and the bottom would be like the part that looks like a kilt, essentially. And I think you would sling it in such a way you could use it as a pouch. Some of it would be a pouch. So the kilt, which is just a bottom half of your body piece of clothing, was adopted, I think, by the wealthy, who wanted to sort of dress like a Jacobite, basically. If you go through the Scottish portrait galleries, you'll see portraits of rich people in their Jacobite style kilts, but they're members of the ruling class who, had they been alive at the time, would have been probably raising armies against the Jacobites. So yeah, so it's not relevant to what we're talking about.
Another cross-pollination, right?
In a way, yeah, between the dominant culture and the receding culture. Yeah, it's true. That's that section. I think I have a bonus, actually last question in this section. It's the bonus question. So I will snip this out of the main episode. Listeners will hear garbled, but Patreon subscribers will get this thing a little further down the line. I actually hadn't prepared this question. I'm just thinking of it on the hoof. They're generally silly questions. So here it is. If you could be a character, anyone from the peasant to the emperor, or Cixi, during the Boxer Rebellion, who would you want to be? People, and they're like, stop it! Shut up!
Yeah.
That's funny. Right, I'll take us into the very final questions now. I'll probably have that cut back in so that listeners will go, and then they'll just hear me yelling, stop it, shut up! And then they'll be wondering, what did Lee do?
Then they have to subscribe, right?
Yeah, pay money to find out what Lee did. Yeah, so the further reading questions, that's the final questions. You do a lot of poetry on the Chinese Literature Podcast, so if listeners want more interesting Chinese poems, can you, well, we can point them to your podcast, but would you point them to any specific poems?
Yeah, we have done quite a bit of poetry. We don't always do that, but we have done a couple that I think really reflect that kind of cross-pollination theme that we've been talking about today. So in the last couple of months, we did a poem on a Uyghur poet. So this is, we read the translation, but since we all know that the Uyghurs are part of the Chinese nation, at least that was what I heard in Beijing, and we'll leave it at that. There is this nationalist poet that we did a podcast on. We did a poem on a Li Bai poem. Li Bai is the 8th century Tang Dynasty poet. He's famous as being kind of the alcoholic of the great Tang poets, and I have a poem which I translated of his. I have a poem of his which I translated as just "Let's party." It's kind of like Tang Dynasty drunken frat boy poetry. It's a rousing good time, lots of just craziness. And Rob and I did 2 poems by 2 Chinese poets in America written in the first decade of the 20th century. One of them is talking about kind of the discrimination he faced. The other one's talking about he just wants to make money. He came over here, he wants to make a lot of money and go home rich. And they sort of represent 2 different veins of the Chinese experience in late 19th century, early 20th century America. And I guess we can put those in, I can highlight those and we can put those on the show notes or on a special website that you can just post the URL to if that works.
Yeah, I definitely will. So you mentioned Li Bai. I have to mention some poets that listeners can check out. You may have heard of this translator. He's called Brian Holton. He's probably one of the star guests I've had on the pod. Maybe not up there with Ken Leo, but probably in the top 5, definitely in the top 10. If he's listening, then definitely top 5. And he's a fellow Scot. He's from the very much the lowlands, I think Galloway. He's from further south than me anyway. They have their own version of Scots there, and when he translates poetry fairly exclusively, and when he translates it, it will either be to plain good old modern English that we all speak, but he'll sometimes also do it into his own Scots. He's got a few books out that are just that. There's one I read, which he came on the show and he read it. I read the plain English and he read the Scots, and it was really cool. And let me stop waffling and find this book. Brian Holton, because I'm just dancing around this thing, not naming the book. Oh yeah, so he's got quite a few, but the one I'm talking about is Stonn Ma Lane, which has trilingual, if you like. It's got Scots, English, and the original Chinese of every poem in it. And there's one Li Bai poem. I remember the Scots name. I don't remember the Chinese or the English. It's bring the bevy ben, like bring the booze, basically. Bring the booze now, quickly.
It totally could be the same poem.
Yeah. And not to say the Scots are all alcoholics. I think that it's a British phenomenon, British and Irish phenomenon, not just a Northern Celtic thing. But yeah, Li Bai writing about drinking does sound pretty good in Scots.
That sounds awesome. I'm gonna have to check that out.
Last question. I think we've established what I'm reading just now. But what are you reading just now?
A bunch of different stuff. I just finished up Donald Westlake's The Hook. Jeremy Goldkorn on Seneca, the famous China podcast.
Jinyu Mi, as he's known.
There we go. He recently recommended this author in their recommendation section. I read one of his books, one of Westlake's books, Somebody Owes Me Money, and it's okay. It's kind of a campy crime novel from 1969. It feels a little bit like James Bond meets Raymond Carver, but The Hook is intensely good. It's 2 novelists meet a decade or 2 after they kind of knew each other when they were starting out writing. One of them has become successful, the other not. The successful one, his name is Bryce, is in the middle of a nasty divorce, and that nasty divorce has kept him from working on a novel, and his editor is calling for blood. He wants the novel right now, and Bryce just doesn't have it. And when he runs into the unsuccessful writer, Wayne, Wayne has a novel, but he has no publisher willing to look at it. When they meet, Bryce asks Wayne to give him Wayne's novel, and they're going to publish it under Bryce's name. Only there's one condition attached to that Wayne has to murder Bryce's wife. And the thrill goes from there. It's that's pretty much the setup. I think it's the first chapter. Yeah. So intensely good. And other things I'm reading, I just finished up Jonathan Spence's The Search for Modern China, or rereading that. When people ask me if I have only one book about China to recommend to them, what would it be? This is always the book that I recommend to them. And so I was just rereading it as I was preparing for some other that writing, the book that I'm writing. And then I'm in the middle of Edwin Burroughs' Gotham. Have you heard of that?
I heard the word Gotham used in all sorts of contexts beyond Batman, but I'm not sure I know the novel.
It's a history of New York City from its beginnings to 1898, and it's this insanely long. I'm listening to the audiobook version of it, and it's I think 67 hours long. So quite long. I mean, the King James version of the Bible is about 90 hours, if that gives you some perspective.
Holy moly! Can I just ask, that novel, The Hook, what was the author called again?
So his real name is Donald Westlake, and he has a pseudonym that he sometimes writes under. Let me check.
Donald Westlake. It's strangely Chinese. Donald Chihu.
Eastern inclination. So his pseudonym is the pen name Richard Stark. Stark. Yeah, okay. But I think he's more often seen as Donald Westlake now.
Got it. I'm all out of questions, so just last wildcard question. Is there anything we've not talked about that you want to talk about?
I think, idiot that I am, I forgot to mention the podcast website, which, we've talked about the Chinese Literature Podcast. It's just the Chinese Literature Podcast, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. And we're on Twitter, ChinLitPod. Check us out.
Yeah, and the way I like to listen to any podcast is going through the back. Well, when I've just discovered it, it's going through the back catalogue. And I know from first ear experience that the Chin Lit Pod has an awesome back catalogue. You can learn loads of interesting stuff. The what was it? Ode to a Dumpster Truck? That was like one of the first few episodes I listened to. That's just burned into my brain. That's an amazing piece of cultural transmission that I would not have known about if I hadn't listened.
There you go. Lei Feng.
Yeah. All right. I will bid you farewell and say thank you very much for coming on the show.
How do you say bye in Scots?
Oh, what would you say? I think, is there lang may your lum reek, but that's not so much goodbye as like a goodwill. I guess there's one. It's a cliche. It's not Scots. Just you take the high road and I'll take the low road, and I'll be in whatever before you.
And we can both be singing Auld Lang Syne as we pass each other on our separate roads.
There you go. Yeah. No, I can't think what Scots for good. I have to Google that now. I know this isn't the most professional, concise listening experience. Scots for goodbye. I've done an image search. That's not very clever. Goodbye. No. See you after. Good luck. Good look. Good luck. Nah, it's just,
that's why there isn't really.
Yeah, I guess if there was an obvious one, I would have. I don't think there is a classic, iconic. Probably. Yeah, lang may your lum reek. You take the low road and I'll take the high road. Except that's a song. That's not something people say. But we're romanticizing, so it doesn't matter.
Angus, thanks for having me on your podcast. It's been a blast.
Well, that's it. Show's over. You're going to have to find something else to listen to quite imminently, I'm afraid to say. But before I vanish completely, I'll just say another really big thank you to Lee Moore and recommend again that you go you all go check out the Chinese literature podcast, My Evil Rivals. I can also recommend, if you're a fan of the show, this show that is, and want to support it, that you go to the True Fic Patreon, the Translated Chinese Fiction Patreon, because you can get more stuff. I am doing my best to keep a bi-weekly, fortnightly, if you like, trickle of bonus episodes coming up, at least to the end of the year. So we've racked up, I don't know, I think it might be over 100 now. We've racked up a very good number of bonus episodes. So even if you wanted to support the show for a couple months, you know, enjoy your access to all that stuff, even download it and hoard it and keep it, you know, I can't stop you doing that. I would probably do that myself if I were in your shoes. And it still benefits me, because if it's a one-off or twice off or 3 months of support for the show, you know, that helps me keep the files up, helps me pay the hosting fees, and maybe contributes to the odd mug of nice cold beer at my local. Not that I really have a local. It might be the church in Mobberley, if you're curious, if you'd really like to know where you can find me like once a month drinking a beer, that might be the place to look. That was a strange plug, but I think I will end on that note. So just remember, before I actually vanish, the best thing you can do for the show is to spread the word IRL, in person. Well, that might not be the best thing, but I'm just going to say it is, because I've been saying that it's the best thing to do for over 70 episodes, so it's too late to turn back and recommend a different thing. So anyway, tell your Jacobite clan leader, tell your local Taoist sage, in return for that recommendation of a good podcast, he should hopefully show you the right methods by which you can become bulletproof, which will aid you in your efforts to expel the local colonizing armies from whichever city you happen to live just outside. Maybe it's Tianjin, maybe it's Sheffield, but in any case, throw up your bonnet and forward the revolution. On that note, 再见.